But my dad had done really well. He'd worked his way up. He worked in finance, worked his way up the insurance ladder, and ended up. He'd worked in Wall Street. Ended up being on the board of directors for a company called Aon, big insurance company, and yeah, and his office was on the 99th floor of the World Trade Center. So he was at work and was killed on 9/11. Well, I was born in Brighton, and I grew up. First part of my life, I was in a little town called Peacehaven, and then when I was about 9 or 10, we moved over to Worthing, um, which was yeah. I always joke about Worthing because when I moved there, it was I think it was one of the largest percentage of old age pensioners living there. So there wasn't a lot for like a young teenage lad to get up to, you know.
What were those early years like for you at home? Mum and dad about?
No, so my mum and dad split up when before I can remember. So I never lived with my dad, and my mum remarried, my dad remarried, and then my mum separated, yeah, separated from her husband, which is why we moved over to Worthing. And my dad, he got divorced from that next marriage and then married again and moved over to America. So he wasn't around much at all. But we used to go to America to see him when we were kids. But yeah, so when we went over to Worthing, we were just living with my mum, and she had a new boyfriend, so we were living in with him for a while. But it was, yeah, it was okay. It got all a bit all over the place, having different sort of dads and stepdads of here, there, and everywhere. But no, it was all right to start with.
Can you remember any particular constant for you? Was your mum your constant? Was the home the constant? What was...
Not really, and I think that was thinking about it. That's an interesting question. It's one of those things where I don't know if there really was. I mean, yes, Mum was always there, always around, and I suppose she was the one. But yeah, I don't know. I think she was working things out. You know, when I look back now, I think she went through a lot, really, different relationships and stuff that she went through in her life. Um, so yeah, it all came to a. I mean, things came to a head. I'd broken my leg when I was 11. I got into quite a bad car accident, and so I was in hospital for ages. And when I came out of hospital, it was when I was changing schools. I was going up to my next school, and because I'd been out of school for probably nearly a year by the time I went back, I just couldn't get back into it, and I got in with the wrong crowd. Maybe I was the wrong crowd to get in with. I don't know. I was disruptive in lessons and all that, and so yeah, we formed a little gang, and we were all into music. So it's when I learnt to play guitar. We had a little band called the Freak Brothers. Weren't very good, um, but yeah, yeah, it was, and we were sort of, we weren't really punks. We were sort of rockabillys, but had a bit of a punky sort of thing, and I guess the attitude to go along with it. So we were just troublemakers, really, stupid little bits of trouble. But yeah, I remember we went to see the Ramones in concert. That was my first gig and loved it. And then we saw their film, Rock and Roll High School. And at the end of the film, they blew the school up. And so we had this stupid idea that we would, do something crazy at school. And so we set fire to the school toilets. And that was really, I've been in a little bit of trouble before that, but that's where it started to get a little bit out of control. And yeah, we started messing around a lot. I got suspended, expelled, and yeah, um, we ended up, started with things that started with shoplifting, ended up with burglary. It was just stupid stuff like that. And then when I was probably about 15, basically my mum had had enough, and we had a big row, and I walked out. Not sure if she kicked me out or if I walked out, and yeah, and I ended up kind of on the streets. really. And slept rough for a few nights and then ended up in a squat. Stayed in the squat, I don't know for how long, you know. It's all a bit of a blur, really. But living there, and there was a few of us there, and we were breaking into cars and nicking things out of cars, selling things that we'd stolen, breaking into allotments to dig up the potatoes and have something to eat. Yeah. And at the time, I was on probation, and so I'd broken my probation order, and the police, they raided the squat that I was on, and they picked me up, and I got my probation officer came along to the police station, and he arranged me to go in a children's home. So I went to a children's home, ran away from that, was picked up again, and taken back, and then eventually, because I was sort of just turning 16, and my probation officer organised like a sort of bed and breakfast that I could live in. So I went to that, but it was just, you know, it was just a place that was a magnet for trouble for me where I was Worthing. So me and my mate, we put our money together, and we went down Shoreham car auction. We bought a clapped out Hillman Hunter for 60 quid, and thought we'd drive north and see what we could find. And we got, I think we probably got about 12 miles, and it broke down, and I ended up, we ended up walking for about a week, and we ended up in Northampton, and bumped into the Jesus Army, who were having a big like campaign giving out food, and it was life-saving, because, you know, we had no money and nowhere to live, didn't know what we were doing with ourselves, and suddenly these guys turn up and, you know, offer us food, offered us a bed. So yeah, I ended up there.
So, I mean, a story around the Jesus Army, the current, you know, anyone Googling it now will see scandal,
Yeah.
you know, and shame and,
Yeah.
and abuse. But actually some positives in your experience. You actually felt that they were a lifeline at that moment.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, the thing is, I think with where the Jesus Army ended up was tragic, because there was, you know, there were stories like mine where people turned up and their lives were rescued, changed, transformed. You know, I was there. So to start with, I was there for 9 months. I didn't get the God thing at all. I was, because of my background, I was running rings around them. I was, you know, I didn't give them my right name when I started. I was conning them out of money. I was just trying to, you know, get away with whatever I could. And they were just incredibly patient. When eventually they found out who I was and what I'd been up to, I got back in touch with, first of all, with my mum, and then with my probation officer. He sorted out for my probation to be transferred up, and then one of the leaders in the house took me down to Worthing because I had an outstanding court case. And the judge says, you look like you're in a good place at the moment, so I'm not going to send you to prison this time. You've got one more chance. You stay with these people. You've got, you know, gave me a community service that I had to do. So yeah, it was my first sort of landing on something a little bit solid, where I thought, you know, where I felt okay, but I really didn't get the God thing. You know, I went along with it as much as I could, but I just didn't get it. And eventually, after it was about 9 months, it was like, I'll just get my own place in Northampton. So I got a flat in Northampton, a little bedsit. And I moved out there, and I was in that place for probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 weeks. And that was long enough for me just to sort of stop and think about life and think about what I wanted to do. And I just thought, actually, they've got something. That's the most solid I've seen, if you know what I mean. And I thought, I need to.
Interesting. How old were you then?
I would have been 16.
It's interesting. A sort of a tide had pushed you and carried you for a certain amount of time, almost drifting on this. I don't know, circumstances were just gathering momentum, and you were going a certain way.
Yeah.
And then Jesus' army, as we've said, has some bad history, but there's a moment where they caught or have the heart to catch a drifter. This kind of guy who's like, let's just catch him for a time.
Yeah.
And that meant a lot to you.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because I think one of the problems with the Jesus Army, it was a community church, residential community, all of that kind of stuff. What started out as something very organic and very wholesome in a way, I suppose because over time and over the time it grew as well, because of the size of it and everything, it just became an institutionalized thing, which had rules that it needed, but those rules meant that it was very controlling, and that kind of control can be abused, and and everything, and that's the sad thing about it. But no, I think there were a lot of really good people there that just had real hearts for God and real hearts for other people, just wanted to make a difference, and I think at the time I was fortunate enough to be one of the people that just fell in with them, and I mean, it was interesting while I was there, because I think just because of the sort of person I am, either not very good at sticking to rules or whatever, I don't know, which put me on the bad side of some of the people there, some of the main leaders in the church, which in hindsight I think was a good thing, but it did mean that I suppose you could call it, I was bullied, but I would sort of shove it to one side and just get on with what I felt like I was, because I felt like some of the things that I was doing was right, and I never had one of those like a Damascus Road conversion. I think, but my conversion experience, if you like, was gentle. It was slow. It was slowly getting to know this Jesus, slow, and so, I did have strong convictions about what I felt I wanted to do and what I felt God wanted me to do as well, and that didn't always fit in with something like the Jesus Army, which had these sort of fairly rigid kind of boxes that it put people in.
Do you remember a point where you, I don't know, for better terms, surrendered or gave in to this God that you'd heard about?
I mean, there was definitely God moments, which all seem a little bit, I don't know. I used to walk from. It was in Northampton, and we had these two houses. There was a place that I was living. It was called Cornhill, and but there was where I'd sort of started out, if you like, was another house sort of over the hill called Sheepfold, and I used to walk between two because and it was a beautiful country walk across these fields and everything. I just remember one day walking across them praying, and I don't even think I was praying for anything specific. I was just sort of praying, and it was sort of early evening, and I was walking, and the sun was going down, amazing sky, and it was just one of those moments, and so that it was things like that I don't know if it was so much. I don't know if it was so much me surrendering. It's almost like God, every now and again, on this journey, He would show up and say, "Look, I'm there.
I'm here, yeah.
I'm there." You know, and you know, I remember we had one meeting that we were at. We had a big marquee that used to travel around, and one meeting that I was at, and yeah, I just felt quite moved, and I went down to the front. You know, we had like an altar call kind of thing, you know, a response thing. I went down to the front and just wept. I don't know why, you know, and it was those sort of moments. So, but so during that kind of time of getting myself back on my feet, I got a job. I met my wife Jean, and we eventually got married. And I'd started to get back in touch with my dad, and so I'd started to visit him in America.
Your biological dad, yeah?
Sorry?
Your biological
Yeah. And you know, he'd moved to America. He'd moved to America when we were kids. We would go over and spend some time with him, and then when I went through my kind of teenage sort of period when it was all over the place, I just lost touch with him, and he didn't want to know. My probation officer wrote to him and asked him, you know, if he'd consider having me going to live with him, and he just flatly refused, you know.
Do you know why? Just because the relationship had broken?
I think he had his family over there to consider as well, and so that was quite a big influence. But it was you know, I just remember it was pretty pathetic what he'd written back, you know. It just obviously either didn't get the seriousness of my situation, or yeah. So
That's a fairly significant rejection.
yeah, and it's been one of the things that I've had to deal with over my life, and I'm really aware of it. So so I have my dad, and then I have my stepdad, and then I have one of my mum's partners and they were all like quite fatherly to, you know, and then they would go. And then I came to the Jesus Army, and I mean, for a while, Noel, the main pastor there, he was, you know, he was sort of,
Father.
yeah, and then just like that, and he would have a history of doing this to people where he, you know, you were a hero, then you were zero, you know, you only, and it didn't take long. And there was another one of the leaders who'd sort of taken me under his wing, was mentoring me, and then he left. And so it was constant like that. And it's interesting you say, because when I started leading the church, and when I started networking with other leaders, I would sort of, without realising it, I would gravitate to people that I thought were more, and I just remember this one incident where you know, there was this Churches Together event, and I was in this, you know, there was a guy that I was you know, I really respected, you know, good friend, but he was a bit of a kind of up there figure, you know, and or that's how I saw him. And he parked his car somewhere, and the traffic warden came over, and he had permission to park there, and the traffic warden was in the wrong, but she wasn't having it that she was in the, and he lost it with her. And it was like it was a moment where the penny dropped, and I thought, actually, these are just humans, these are just people, I don't need that kind of thing anymore. It was a really weird, you know, sort of time for me, but it took a long time, because it took a long time for me to get there, because for a long time I was always looking for that person that I could, you know.
Yeah, it's really deep, and I think for a lot of men watching this, that orphan spirit or that feeling of needing fatherhood is a really significant piece.
Yeah.
A lot missing.
Yeah. And you know, for me, with hindsight, I look at the relationships that I've had, right from, and they've all, I don't know, in some degree or another, they've all failed. but in all of them there were moments of real blessing and real depth, and so not so it's never been a constant, but it's always been something that, you know, I've always had somebody. It's a bit like, yeah, you know, and you know, and it is. I do get quite emotional sometimes if I'm watching a film or something where there is a real father's influence in the film. You know, I feel that, and I think I've never had that, but I've got to the point now where that, you know, I think actually it's okay because I've kind of had it in bits.
Do you feel like you've become a different father because of that? In a positive sense, you've modelled differently to your kids.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I mean, it's interesting because, you know, when you start, when you become a dad, you how do I do this? And there are times when I look back and I think, oh, I really screwed up there, you know. But there are, you know, if I look at my kids now, I mean, you know, me and my daughter, we work on projects together. It was just great, you know. It's just been great, sort of doing that, and you know, things like teaching her to drive, or with my son, you know, sort of hanging out with him when he's up here, and everything, and yeah, we have you know, with the kids, we have a really good relationship, and I think I've learnt a lot just from what, I wouldn't say from what I didn't have, although that's probably part of it, but yeah, I don't know.
So did you manage to get to see your dad in America?
So yeah, so I started going. I mean, it was another thing. I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do this again, you know, without, because you know, I would go over once a year to see him, which was, you know, obviously I wouldn't have been able to afford that in my, yeah. So and I would go over for a few weeks a year and see him, and we sort of started to repair our relationship. Yeah, and then when I started going out with Jean, when we got married, we went over, had our, we sort of had an extended sort of time over there and went on a road trip for a bit of a honeymoon sort of thing. So that was great, you know. Yeah, so, but my dad had done really well. He'd worked his way up. He worked in finance, worked his way up the insurance ladder, and ended up. He'd worked in Wall Street. Ended up being on the board of directors for a company called Aon, big insurance company, and yeah, and his office was on the 99th floor of the World Trade Center. So he was at work and was killed on 9/11, which was, and I think that just in terms of my faith, you know, you said, was there ever a moment where you really surrendered? I think that's, I used to say that was the time when the rubber hit the road, because I went, we live in Coventry now, and in Coventry Cathedral you've got the ruins. The cathedral was bombed in the war. It's an amazing place if you go and see the ruins of the old cathedral. Behind the altar you've got this Father Forgive, and I remember going down there a couple of days after 9/11 and looking at that, and then having an argument with God, and then going through this whole process of well, do I even believe in God if crap like this happens? You know, you look at the mess the world's in, and you know, I look at my life and I think, well, you know, no, Dad, you know, I've lived on the street, everything's gone wrong in my life, and then sort of putting it all together and thinking, actually, no, everything hasn't gone wrong, and I have known some amazing love, and I can't just stop believing in God. And so when I got to this point where I, okay, God's there, is God good? Or is he some sort of malevolent dictator? Is he a father figure? What is he, you know? And Yeah, I mean, it's sort of similar process, and I just thought, actually, no, I can't think anything other than God is good. I don't know really what that means, and I don't know how that works out, and I don't know why. But it was my kind of start where I could say, okay, I believe in God, and I believe God's good, and I believe that that goodness and that love is bigger than all the crap and all the mess that we see in the world. And so I've got to be bigger. You know, if I'm gonna, if I'm saying I believe that, then I've got to demonstrate that somehow. And that was kind of how, you know, I don't know if I'd say it was a second conversion, but it was a kind of, right, okay, I get what this is all about now. This isn't just about being part of a church and doing Christian things. This is about actually, you know, it's deeper than that. It's making a difference.
Was there a process for you in terms of hearing about your dad and the obvious grief, shock?
Mm.
Did it turn to anger, unforgiveness? Because it's not natural circumstances, is it? This is a terrorist act. How did you process those things, if they occur?
Yeah. So, I think it starts with the forgiveness, and what the journey that I kind of went on. It was, I suppose, it was mixed. It was mixing, you know, that's all part of the same. It's all part of this kind of mix, you know, the anger and the forgiveness and everything like that. And it's like you're angry that it happened, and then you've got to you see the news clips of the guys that did it, and they're walking through airport security and just getting knocked in. Do you know what I mean? So then it's confusion, because are you angry with them? Are you angry with the security for letting them on? You know, what are you angry with? And who have you got to forgive? Have you got to forgive them for doing it? Have you, you know, and then this was all in the immediate, you know, kind of months that followed. I'm angry with my dad for being there. I mean, he'd broken his leg, and so his ankle was still in the cast when he was there. You know, he shouldn't have gone into work, really. You know, so I'm angry with him, and then that anger spills over to where you know, the time that you shouldn't have been there, you were there, and when you should have been there when I was a kid and you weren't there, and it's all a mix like that, you know. And then you're dealing with that and forgiveness there. I had horrible experiences at the place that I worked at. I worked for a pharmacy, big pharmacy company. I was an HR manager by then, and they were not particularly supportive. And you know, I wanted to do a fundraising thing, and they had a big charitable kind of fund. And they were, when I said I was going to do a fundraising thing, they were all for it. And then I said I wanted to raise money for the Red Cross in Afghanistan. And they said, well, you know, absolutely not. You know, if this was for the victims, we'd do it, but we're not raising money for Afghanistan. They breed terrorists, blah, 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 you know. And I thought, you know, and I just got really angry with them and for everything, you know. And then, so yeah, you have all these different people, and then sort of looking at myself and interestingly, there's a prayer at the cathedral that is written down at the altar. It's called the Litany of Reconciliation, and it's all about forgiveness. It starts with the hatred that divides nation from nation, race from race, class from class. Father, forgive. And one of the things, and it goes through all this stuff, the lust that brings dishonour and stuff like this. Father, forgive. Covetous desires. Father, forgive. And it doesn't say Father forgive them, it's just generally Father forgive, and you really, you know, then you sort of realise, well, I'm just part of this. I'm just, you know, and so you sort of, you want to forgive yourself, or you're angry with yourself for how you're reacting. So yeah, forgiveness and anger, I think, all come to a head. And interestingly, the hardest people to forgive are the people that you feel you should trust the most. You know, people that are closer to you. So for me, the guys that did it, the terrorists, whilst what they did was abhorrent and awful, there is this ideology that, whilst it doesn't really make, it's ridiculous and it doesn't make sense and it's completely wrong, you get how they could have got where they got to do it. And you think, if only somebody had stepped into their lives to change them. And so in some ways that's an easier process to get to the point of forgiveness, whereas people that are close to you, say people in our church, when after 9/11 I thought, I've got something to say now, and I left my job and I started doing music as a job, which the leadership of the Jesus Army really frowned on. It was like, oh, Rob wants to go and be a rock star, Rob wants to be a prima donna strutting his stuff on stage or whatever, and that wasn't at all what I was doing, but that was the message that was put out there. And so I was not treated particularly well by church, and so that was really difficult, and that was a hard thing to forgive.
That's really powerful, mate. I heard a story recently. There's this lady, a missionary in the Congo. She's died now, and she was treated terribly.
Yeah.
And in the midst of it, she cried out to God, and she felt God said to her, "Will you thank me for this experience?
Right.
Even if you never see why I'm allowing it."
Yeah.
And I feel like that's similar to where you've been. There is a new story afterwards.
Yeah.
Of how you discovered music and how you've used experiences in your life to storytell the depth of what's happened to you. Do you feel like that you've got to a place where you say, God, I don't understand this, but I trust you?
Yeah. I mean, it's doing what I do for a living is, the fact that I do it and it works. I have no idea how it works. Because, it's one of those things, when you start doing something like this, you can't help but have this idea that, well, in a couple of years, I'm going to be on this big stage somewhere. Do you know what I mean? And it's one of these stories that I tell and I make a bit of a joke of, because, I produced an album with some of the musicians, like Paul Evans from Delirious was the drummer on my first album, and I used some of Kathy Burton's band. Do you know what I mean? All these session musicians that were really well known at the time, and I thought, this is a brilliant album. I've got it done, and this is going to rock it, and nothing happened, And then a friend of my dad's was a cameraman who lived in New York, and he knew a film producer, an Emmy-winning film producer, and so he put me in touch, and we shot this video in New York City, and spent a ton of money on it, and I thought, this is it, this brilliant sort of this single and this great video, Emmy-winning producer, brilliant, and nothing happened. And I got invited to do a live session on Radio 2, and I thought, again, Radio 2, live to the nation, this is it, and nothing happens, and and last night I was gigging in a little folk club for 40 people, and that's what I do. Folk clubs and churches, 150 people at the most in the audience. But it keeps going, and I keep getting, I keep getting messages and texts, emails, whatever, from people that have been to gigs with just stories, and I look back and I think my songs have been sung. My songs have been sung to walk people down the aisles at weddings, sung at funerals. Some guy had one of my songs tattooed on his arm, which I think's a bit weird, but creepy. No, it's fine. There's another somebody else had one of my songs on their gravestone, which I think, wow.
It's a big impact.
Yeah, and I think it doesn't matter, and I'm still doing it, and somehow it still keeps going, and I just go and I tell my stories, and I tell other people's stories as well, people that I've met on this journey. So yeah.
Well, I think what's interesting is you're a very creative storyteller, but there's a there's a bigger story that you're telling. There's a God who loves you. There's a
I think with storytelling, storytelling, you have to be honest. And what I can never, so it's interesting because you asked, was there a moment? And and everybody wants to hear about the moment, and I've never had that moment, and I'm still getting converted. I'm still on this journey. I still have days that I'm riddled with doubt. I still wonder, I don't think I question if there's a God, but I after time I don't get it, and I think, and I struggle with my faith and struggle with doubts, and I think that's okay, I hear about people that seem to have a hotline to heaven and they get through straight away, and it doesn't always happen to me. But there is something, I think for me there's this kind of thing where I think, okay, sometimes I feel closer than other times, but always there's that. I know God's there. I know God's here with me. I don't feel it. I feel, a million miles from anything. And and they can be quite dark times, I have a lot of self-doubt. I mean, well, one of the on my wall over there, I've got all those things. A part of that was somebody suggested that I do that because, as a reminder to myself, not to sort of show off, but to say, look, this is some of the things you've done.
Yeah. So to people who can't see, you obviously wrestle with a lot of self-doubt. But how many albums? 15.
Yeah, 15 albums. Yeah.
It's quite a lot of writing and singing. out of all these albums, out of all this writing, is there anything you've penned and sung that really captures you?
Goodness me, I don't know. I think particularly with my last 3 or 4 albums, they're very linked to what I've been going through the last few years. And sometimes you'll have a song that you just, that gets sung over and over and over again for years and years and years. I suppose I don't know. I mean, at the moment, I'm singing a song at the moment called "The Space Between" a lot, which is quite a sort of, I don't know. It is quite a meditative song, I suppose, because that's where I feel like I am, and that's where I felt like I am for the last few years, where I'm in between things. Particularly since Jesus Army wrapped up. We after Jesus Army wrapped up, we planted another church, and then moved on from that. And we moved on, but we're still moving on, but we're not really sure where we're going. And so we've not really rooted ourselves anywhere permanent. And, just in terms of life and jobs and where we live and all of that kind of stuff, we're very sort of in this kind of in-between, this liminal kind of space.
Is that a comfortable space for you? Are you a bit of a pilgrim type? If I was to say you're here now for life, you'd be like, let me out.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. Let me out. No, but and it's funny because this song "Space Between" is, I think, so it's about being at peace with the space between, because I think for me, it's like, okay, in between, waiting for the next thing. I feel like God's teaching me to hang on. You just settle. You just be at peace with where you're at, and then we'll see what's next. And it's a little bit like that, which is difficult for me.
And very honest, because I think people often present an altogether picture, and and you're being very honest that that's not the case.
Mm.
And that's not an easy place to be, but...
Yeah. But, yeah, I mean, there is a song there's a song called Come Take Your Place, which I think is probably, at the moment, the nearest to the broader picture. And it's a song about welcome. And it's basically, it's kind of, you know, it talks about being on a journey and coming to this sort of, I don't know, call it a halfway house, just call it a safe place or something like that. And it's just, you know, come and sit down, have a meal with us, take off your pack, just rest for a little while. And I think that's me, you know, it's me wanting to be, for other people, that companion that you're safe to do that with, but wanting to be that person that finds that safety as well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So, a couple of questions to land it. As an artist, a creator, creative, I always like to ask people, because when you put something out there, it can be understood, experienced in a load of different ways.
Yeah.
What would you hope that people would pick up or gather from listening to your music?
My kind of mantra, I have this logo thing that says "Love is bigger," and for me, the thing that I want to communicate is just that love is bigger than all the crap. Love is bigger than the mess of this world. That God, if there is a God, God is bigger than all of this, and his heart is wide enough to take us in wherever we're at and whatever we feel like. That's, I think, the heart of what I want to, I feel is my message. And that, you know, this idea of come take your place, you know, there is a safe place in God.
That's great, mate. How can people find you?
My website is robhalligan.co.uk. I'm on Facebook under Halligan Music. Yeah.
YouTube, Spotify.
YouTube is just Halligan, and all of that. But yeah, Rob Halligan. Put Rob Halligan in, and you'll see me with a cowboy hat.
And your songs are available in all the normal.
All the normal places. Yeah.
Thank you, mate, for that. It's very honest.
Yeah, you're very welcome.